IT is a differentiator. It's how businesses enable innovation and drive new value. IT modernization and transformation are now broadly held corporate imperatives. But what does modern mean in an IT world? How do you weave hybrid and multi-cloud strategies into DevOps initiatives? How do you find the right balance between governance and innovation? Hello, and welcome to this video webcast titled At Modernization, People, Process, Technology, brought to you by Insight, VMware, and IDG. My name's Tom Schmidt, Digital Content Director at IDG Strategic Marketing Services, and I'll be the host of today's webcast. Joining me is Jeff Bozic, Principal Architect for Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation portfolio. Jeff has been helping large enterprises modernizing their IT operations on their journey to DevOps and becoming cloud native. Hello, Jeff.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time today, and looking forward to the discussion with Chad, and hopefully you can get some insights in terms of what we're seeing from our clients and in the industry around digital transformation. Thanks, Tom.
Terrific. Also joining me is Chad Sakac, Vice President of the VMware Tanzu Value Advisor team. Chad leads a team that's helping customers modernize their applications and infrastructure to deliver better software to production continuously. Welcome, Chad.
Tom, thank you. And thank you, Jeff, for being my partner in this. And thanks on behalf of VMware and our friends at Insight and IDG to everyone who's attending this. It's going to be an awesome session.
Excellent. Jeff, before we jump into our discussion today, can you tell our audience a little bit about Insight, the company?
Yes, thanks, Tom. So Insight's a large global provider of IT solutions and services for our clients in a capacity around the globe. We're a Fortune 500 organization founded in around 1988, providing services everything from how you manage your endpoints and desktops all the way through modernizing your data center and your cloud operations, and even extending into how you write and replatform your applications in app development. I focus in the cloud and data center portion of the business and really helping folks modernize IT in this context of their cloud native journey. How does DevOps and Agile and infrastructure and cloud platforms and as a service models all come together to ultimately help a client achieve their cloud native goals?
I'll add one thing to that, Jeff. Insight's also a great VMware partner. You know what? In fact, it's maybe the right way to start this is to actually refocus on a customer story. So I want everybody to just watch this for the next 4 minutes or so. It's an incredible testimony to why this app modernization thing matters in the first place.
Fiserv recently had an amazing success in a very trying time for our country, and it was all due to our partnership with VMware Tanzu and Spring. Hi, my name is Keith Fulton, and I'm proud to be the CIO of the Account Processing Division at Fiserv. For those of you who don't know Fiserv is a financial services company offering a wide variety of products and services around the world. But my division, the Account Processing Division, serves more than 4,000 financial institutions, banks, and credit unions, which represents about 36% of the U.S. market. As you know, in March, the COVID virus hit America and caused us to go into a lockdown period very rapidly. Congress jumped into action and passed the CARES Act incredibly quickly to provide a stimulus package to people affected by the lockdown. One of those groups was the small businesses whose revenue almost went to zero overnight. And so they created the Payroll Protection Program as part of that law to enable the Small Business Administration to lend out money to help keep these small businesses afloat. The Small Business Administration then empowered banks and credit unions to be their agents to administer these loans and make sure they were okay, and then submit them to the SBA for approval. So naturally, Fiserv, in support of that, had to leap into action and create a bunch of products to help our banks and credit unions do this effectively. And we had to do it in a short amount of time. So we had to build an application portal, first of all, that allows small business owners to go through a wizard process and apply for a loan. We also had to build workflow solutions for the back offices of these FIs to flesh out the applications, get the appropriate documentation, judge the risk level, and so on. Then we had to create a portal for the FIs to use to track all of these, because some banks had thousands of these loans. So at the last stage, we had to build API connectivity to the SBA so that we could submit these loans when they were ready to make sure that we could get approval or decline decisions from the SBA in a matter of seconds. To do that, we did an incredible amount of work. in a short period of time. We had about 15 developers of different disciplines, and they created over 100,000 lines of code and did 436 releases to production of our product in 28 days. All of this was enabled because of Fiserv's partnership with VMware and the Tanzu application service infrastructure that we already had in place waiting for an emergency like this. We also use the Spring framework extensively to do this. Spring helps you with building APIs. It wraps around everything you're doing and allows you to focus on the business logic in any of your RESTful services. Spring Boot helps you run those things. It makes very tight, compact containers that start up very quickly, and it helps our Tanzu infrastructure be efficient. And then we also used Spring Security to protect these APIs and to make sure they were secure from day one. All of this led to an amazing outcome. Okay, we processed in a matter of weeks tens of thousands of these loans, and over 18,000 of those went through our portal in just a few days. That was totaled up to about $1.4 billion worth of funds that we helped our clients get into the hands of their clients. So how did this become such a great success? I really think it boils down to three things. One was we had a cross-functional team and a strong leadership commitment to get this done and to make it come together. We really felt like we were on a mission to help save these companies and to make sure that we could minimize the impact of the lockdown on the economy. Second thing was, if we hadn't had our cloud infrastructure ready with Tanzu, we never would have made this. It was a key success factor to being sure we could go at the speed we needed to. Thirdly, we had a highly agile team with fully automated CI/CD processes that enabled us to release our software almost instantly. This is the way we were able to get more than 400 releases done in 4 weeks. All of this had an amazing effect on our client community too. Brenda Hooker, the CEO of Community Service Credit Union, wrote us and said, the most important thing to all of us was that we work together to help our community. And it's a good feeling. And I can tell you that she felt that, but so did Fiserv. We were working with our clients, meeting with them every day to show them progress with these products. And it was amazing partnership that we had with them to get this done. Jeff Stark, the CTO of Bank OZK, wrote us and said, Fiserv helped us get over 2,000 PPP loans approved through the SBA in 2 days. This is a huge win for our company and our customers. And with genuine tears in my eyes and on behalf of our customers, our employees, and our company, thank you. That's a very powerful note to get from a client CTO, I can assure you. Finally, I'll tell you a quote from my own CTO, Clint Myers, who said, we could not have done this without our partnership with VMware and their Tanzu platform. So thank you very much for VMware, for all your support. And to the rest of you, enjoy the rest of the Spring One conference. Thank you very much.
There you have it in Keith's own words. Our friends at Fiserv were able to make huge advancement in delivering something that mattered to their business in a matter of days. And in the end, delivering a new application, in this case to issue Paycheck Protection Program loans, resulted in $1.8 billion worth of loans issued in just a matter of weeks, and tens of thousands of businesses saved, and ultimately hundreds of thousands of small business employees who, through this COVID crisis, are able to keep their jobs. So it's a real reminder that what we're talking about for the remainder of this session is really important. It impacts lives, businesses, and people. And it's all about people, process, and culture.
Yeah, Chad, there are some really amazing, that's a really amazing story. And there's some really interesting tidbits about what enabled that success for Fiserv in such a short amount of time. And today, we're going to take this in more of a Socratic discussion type of a presentation today. It's not just going to be a bunch of slideware that Chad and I are talking to. And a lot of those points of what made this successful are going to come out today throughout our discussion. So sit back, hope you enjoy, and hope you learn a thing or two.
So what do you see on the screen? What does this picture represent? It represents a bar fight. Now, what characterizes a bar fight? Here we're obviously talking about a metaphorical bar fight, but in real life, bar fights are wasted energy, testosterone-driven events that are much ado about nothing. And what Jeff and I were thinking about is that in our industry, there's a lot of energy that gets spent on debates that actually aren't particularly meaningful. You could think about this actually, in the container war battles. People spent a ton of blood, sweat, and tears, getting into bar fights over, Is it Mesosphere or is it Kubernetes? Which of the public clouds is right? Is it all about on-prem or off-prem? What's another example of one of these wasted energy things that you've seen in your experience, Jeff?
It's interesting because it really, a lot of the things that you mentioned are what we see people fighting about. And ultimately, it boils down, we see people fighting about mechanisms with which to enable what they're trying to accomplish. And to your point, I think they're fighting about the wrong thing is let's have a discussion about what we're trying to accomplish in the first place. Better yet, if we can build that to the point where people can leverage whatever mechanisms they want and not have to fight about that at all. But ultimately, we're picking the mechanism that we're fighting about, which I think is the wrong place to start.
That's the key, right? So these various mechanisms, they come and they go. People get very passionate about them. I think it's a characteristic of our industry that sometimes we focus on the piece parts as opposed to the objective, as you said. What's the business outcome that's the North Star? What's the thing that really matters, in the end?
So Chad and Jeff, what can people do to make sure they're focusing on what really matters?
Well, not to be super cliche about it, but I think bringing in a third-party resource to help is really critical. What we find oftentimes is people's internal biases are oftentimes in the way of what that decision-making is. The bar fights that they're creating are based off of wanting to maintain their own fiefdoms that they've created or doing things in the way that they believe are necessary. And so ultimately, understanding what those common goals are, what is the business driver and who's actually leading that, but having a third party that can start to bridge those gaps, start to have conversations to understand what that picture needs to look like and really be able to remove some of the biases. The age-old adage, if you don't know what you don't know, is more important now than ever, because with things being so new, there's so much that people don't know about. And so you start ending up fighting about things where you don't have all the information, or you're basing it off of misperceptions, or maybe someone's opinion that you read online. So really being able to have a comprehensive picture, someone that doesn't have the biases of how things were done in the past or interpersonal relationship issues, I think is a great way to start.
And another thing I would just add to that, Jeff, I think you're completely right. What's this interesting picture that you can see on your screen? This is basically building a better mousetrap, or these Rube Goldberg machines, these incredibly complex machines that do nothing in the end. What's interesting is that the world that is the modern app world is rooted in an incredibly exciting, dynamic world of open source software. The Cloud Computing Foundation is filled with projects galore. And you can, if you're someone that likes to play with technology, you can make a career out of literally just building one Rube Goldberg machine after another. In fact, I'm convinced, after years of being in this industry and recognizing myself a little bit in the faces of these people here, look at how excited they are about this incredible machine that they've constructed, right? If you think about your own interactions, people on your team, if you're a technologist, you are fascinated by the components of the machine and optimizations that you can make in the componentry of the task. And that links back to the, why people get in these passionate, arguments. I've also found that in some cases and in some enterprises, whether people are doing it consciously or unconsciously, it's a form of career protection. You build a machine that's so complex that ultimately you're the only one who can keep it working. And, while that can feel good, whether it's being done consciously or unconsciously, in the end, it doesn't actually help in the mission and what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish.
Right.
Yeah. The irony there, Chad, too, is that drive and that motivation to solve and to optimize are so necessary and valuable for an organization. And so if you can find ways to harness that, but reapply it in a way that actually is adding value, can be so useful for organizations. I always say the tribal knowledge is still very important for how things get done. But to your point, a lot of that needs to start shifting in how you think about what the tribal knowledge is really helping you to design and optimize for. But understanding how to optimize something in that engineering mindset is really important for figuring out the people that are motivated to want to do good things for your organization. And once you start to get to that model that is working and you now need to start optimizing, having that mind for it can be really what you need.
Fair enough. You've touched on this, but can you give us some hard examples of where this has been done right or been done wrong?
I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, a really useful technique is to constantly reframe every decision through that North Star. We've got to improve our customer experience, for example, right? Is this decision going to, improve customer experience? Sometimes a little bit lower down than the business objective, it's constantly to reframe it around the idea of the most important metric for modern cloud native software development is the speed of an iteration. Mm-hmm. How fast can a developer take an idea and get it into production? Because whether you're a SpaceX building rockets or whether you're a software developer that's developing a modern application within an enterprise, if your speed of iteration is quick, it means that you can respond quickly, ideas can go through and get tried and fail. And therefore, asking yourself, are we doing something that improves or doesn't help the speed of an iteration? Keeping your mind on those metrics is a really useful thing for every team. Examples that I've seen in my experience beyond the Fiserv example that we talked about earlier and you saw, T-Mobile used these techniques and it's interesting. In the last few years, T-Mobile went from a distant, not number one, not number two carrier in the U.S. to being wildly successful and ultimately acquiring Sprint and being the fastest growing carrier in the Americas. How did that happen? They actually made a North Star when they got a new CEO that came in and said, we're going to be the uncarrier. Well, what's being the uncarrier? So again, business objective. Well, it means that we have to basically offer the coolest, best new devices the most quickly and not bind the customers to one plan or another. Now, that was, again, a business imperative one step down. They realized they needed to support new device launches much more quickly, and they needed to modernize their app stack. But keeping that North Star constantly in their mind was a thing that was critical to keep them focused on not building Rube Goldberg machines.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chad. I completely agree. And I hear a lot of the same themes from our clients. And I have two examples that I think really illustrate this trap that's really easy to fall into. Probably the biggest one I see right now is the concept of automation and really even around infrastructure automation and infrastructure as code. I see in a lot of ways organizations and especially IT teams believing that they need to build this infrastructure as code platform kind of in their own silo. And they build for the existing processes of how things need to deploy. And they can build the most amazing templates of deployment. And they can use vRealize automation and create an amazing service catalog, fully API accessible, fully automated, and accessible via automation. But yet, if they're not actually driving that towards what the developers need and how they want to consume, then are you actually adding value to the overall organization? And you might even be creating more technical debt of having to rethink about how you wrote your templates, how you're managing those templates, how you're securing them, what they're actually deploying in the first place, how they're being consumed. So it's one of those things that is a necessary component to moving faster and delivering software faster. Infrastructure teams need to own this, but you cannot own it in your silo or vacuum.
If you're wondering what the connection is with this picture that's on the screen is basically when you live in the Bay Area and you buy a house. I bought a house there. Final part of getting your mortgage was, hey, heads up, you live in a liquefaction zone. And I asked the question, what the heck is a liquefaction zone? They said, well, don't worry about it. I'm like, no, I'm a little worried now. Please, I'd like to know what this is. It turns out that, the red spots on the map, if there's an earthquake, even a moderate earthquake, the soil turns into a fluid and your house will sink into the ground. Now, the metaphor there is that, back to Jeff's point, infrastructure teams and infrastructure are a critical part of this modern app journey. And if you have the DevOps team or the app teams running separately from a well-run foundation of solid infrastructure, whether that's on premises or whether it's in the public cloud, is secondary, you are going to end up with a house that will fall into the ground. So infrastructure matters. Infrastructure teams have got a critical part of that journey. It is the foundation for the application layer of the stack.
It's so true, Chad. I see this being missed. I think a lot of it is people don't even realize that a lot of that's why Shadow IT was born in the first place. And the fact that, on-premises infrastructure teams couldn't provide the capability that the application teams needed to run a modern application, a truly microservice-based app that is driven and deployed automatically via automated CI/CD pipelines that are containerized. And so, born with Shadow IT. But that doesn't mean that is the house that should be built. That's a general purpose hotel and not a house built for what you're trying to accomplish. And even if you want to build that in a public cloud, I still think infrastructure teams are critically important. How you start to deploy those things. I mean, the concepts of reliability, the concepts of performance, the concepts of availability, of data protection, service uptime, those are still really critical, that you have this team of people that need to support and provide. And it's funny too, because I think this ties back to the whole siloed piece. And you mentioned measurement and observation. And I think that's a really important point where, we see we call them proxy metrics of where I might be measuring. So for instance, let's take the infrastructure team, and they might start measuring how quickly they can deploy. And because they start writing these templates, they might be able to now reduce their deployment from 2 days to 2 hours or something along those lines. And so they're using that metric to say, look at the value we're doing. Look, we're doing good things. We're shortening this deployment time. But if you then take a step back and realize, well, they're doing that, but they're doing it with the wrong requirements. There's no process of how requirements are flowing all the way from a user story down to what the infrastructure's code needs to be driven as. So even though we deployed it, we're going to have to maybe make some changes after the fact, or we're going to have to go change some configuration pieces, or maybe we realize that there wasn't a security requirement. And now you look at that total time it took, and maybe you actually increased that total time it took to deploy. And so, even understanding how you measure things of realizing, oh, we made gains, we're going faster. Well, maybe not if you take the bigger picture and start looking across what that overall pipeline is to actually deploy an application on an infrastructure.
And maybe the last thing before we transition to kind of the next major part of the discussion, if you think about, as listeners to the things you heard from Jeff and my dialogue, what does that mean to an infrastructure team? A, you have a mission and it's important. You are the foundation on which the house will be built. Two, you need to be thinking about this idea of the platform as product. You are a product manager. You're thinking about the user story of the developer. If you have a mindset that says, I do this and they're going to use it come hell or high water, you're not going to be successful. So great product teams are constantly listening to their customers and thinking about that from a product management standpoint. You are responsible for the platform product. There's some great books on this that, we'll talk about at the end of this session. The other thing that, is very, very important is that trying to build gates to consumption of the services it's an anti-pattern. You may think that you're trying to do something right, but you need to build a programmable declarative API to everything that you're providing. And that means that you're setting a kind of a new contract between the infrastructure team and the app team. And that's really what DevOps and DevSecOps is really about. Those are the sort of things that you should be thinking about. But, that's a very important and exciting charter. Frankly, people often think of this Kubernetes thing as a developer thing. It's really actually more of an infra evolution thing because it forces some of those characteristics onto a developer-friendly infrastructure stack.
Yeah, Chad, that change in mindset, it all can be wrapped up in culture. I found that word can turn people off sometimes because they don't think it either applies or it's bigger than what they can control or what they can affect, maybe is a better way to think about it. But ultimately, when you think back about Keith and Fiserv in that video, to me, there's some really interesting points of what enabled them to actually accomplish what they did in such a fast amount of time. And to me, the biggest points that I heard were that there was leadership that was already in this mindset of wanting to move this way. And it was a top-down initiative driven by a very compelling event that had a very short time frame of saying, we need to execute on this. But beyond just having that leadership focus, which is absolutely imperative, and having that executive sponsorship, was they had already had in place a lot of what you're talking about, these cross-functional teams. They already were agile. They already had cross-functional teams. They already had established CI/CD pipeline, and they already had familiarity with Tanzu. Tanzu didn't just solve the problem. They didn't have this problem, bring it in and like, oh, it solved it for us. They already had a lot of the skill sets of working with that product. They had the processes necessary. They had the people, but ultimately they already had an organization that was ready and willing and understanding of what it would take to start delivering software in a new way, of breaking down those barriers between app dev and infrastructure and security and operations, and having them work together to ultimately get to that common goal. One of the other kind of ways I look at it from infrastructure teams is, I know it's hard to admit that your customer is starting to change to the developer and that your goal is now to provide a developer experience, but recognize that the developer is not just making choices in some black room of what they think makes sense. It's being driven by what customers are demanding. And the business is saying, this is how we want to reach and react to respond to customers. This is what they're asking for. And that's then driving the developers of what they're pushing for. And so for us to enable that, we all need to start working together.
Chad, I loved your earlier example of T-Mobile's CEO coming in and saying, we're going to become the uncarrier. What's the role of leadership in times like this, times of change and transformation?
I think that you've made a great insight there, Tom, that is jumping right off of what Jeff said. And you can link it back to the Fiserv example, just like Jeff did. The leadership role is critical. In my experience, they understand that the reason that sometimes people get into bar fights, the reason sometimes they build better mousetraps, the reason that sometimes they create silos of excellence that separate the infra team from the dev team is human nature. And it's leaders' roles to frankly say, hey, this is going to be challenging. It's going to be exciting. Follow me, which sounds trivial, right? But what they did in each one of those cases is a pattern. One, they highlighted the urgency of change. So they highlighted that there's an important change that needs to occur, and they messaged it consistently, and they always framed it in the largest idea in the room. In other words, they kept people focused on the big picture and reminded people that to leave the petty squabbles aside. The second thing that is really challenging for the leadership is that while every enterprise has got this transformation and modern application they have to build, they always, no enterprise is a greenfield. And they have to also, at the same time that they're doing this, they inevitably have legacy applications and legacy ITIL processes that are not going away. And there's a tendency in many of these transitions for the new team that's focused on developer-friendly patterns for infrastructure and platforms and building modern apps that have iteration cycles that are measured in minutes to hours, to diminish the importance of the people who are in essence paying the bills and keeping the lights on,
right?
Who have projects that are measured in waterfall cycles that are measured in years. The leader has to highlight that both of these things are important, that the change requires this to be good and continue to operate at the same time that the models that were used organizationally, operationally, technologically for that traditional world won't carry over into the new world. That's a very challenging thing for any leader. But in my experience, that's the two critical things that they do. Clear path, stated urgency of now and change, and then helping the teams kind of bridge that reality that within an enterprise, you're going to have a legacy and you're going to have a new environment, and that they're both important.
Chad, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the large clients here in Southern California that we're working with, a large financial institution, go through their cloud native transformation and journey. And they had been on this path for about 4 years. They've worked with a few other partners and have been doing a lot of good things. And they have a development shop that's developing in new development patterns of microservices. They're containerizing their apps. They're building an API economy. A lot of it's driven through infrastructure as code. They have pretty well developed CI/CD pipeline. And as we started to get in there, first of all, the question becomes, well, why are they asking for help? So you really start to dig into it. And one of my colleagues, I loved the way he phrased it. It was so simple. And he said, they've invested in all the things DevOps, but they're not doing DevOps. And, I think it really starts to highlight how important, and also what we're finding is the executive leadership's there, but it's not pressing down what that message is. And so now we're starting to collect data of showing, hey, they're doing all these things, but these are the friction points. And here's, what's going to take to get around that. It's not a tool. You have the tools, you have the skill sets. Some of the processes are there. What else is missing?
It's very challenging also for a leader who's under pressure, and there's pressure everywhere on everyone, to avoid framing the questions in the following form. Are you in your project budget? So one thing that's very challenging is inside the DevOps model, a project budget is very difficult to mate with an agile methodology where you're focusing on short-term iterations and improvements. It's very difficult because people normally think about budgets in 12-month cycles. Or another common thing for a leader to do when under pressure is to basically look for metrics that are not the leading metrics of time of an iteration. So for example, let's say that there's an outage event that occurs for an application that's a critical application. And the team say, hey, listen, this was actually within our error budget. And then to lose it on the team when they're trying to develop this experiment, fail, learn, iterate culture. And then they get whacked with that's unacceptable. You need to have 100% uptime. That doesn't fit into the model of, again, experimentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That may actually be the right model for some of the classic parts of the business. But the leaders themselves have got to kind of evaluate, how am I measuring success? How am I encouraging this? And again, this picture, is a Leonardo da Vinci set of things. Interesting thing is human nature has been consistent for years, even through periods of change. This is a time where things are changing, and human nature is very resistant to change. And so a leader has to be the one who has to be the most willing to kind of evaluate their own way of evaluating what's good and what's not in these periods of change. They need to be the one to break the human nature to be risk averse, change averse, and think about the human nature of their own teams, their own communication, their own cultures.
Chad, something you said there, I think segues perfectly into kind of the next thing we wanted to talk about in the picture there of this, the start finish line. I think the big hurdle in a lot of people's minds with this transformation is the shift from project mode to product mode. And I think, projects have a very defined start and finish. And I think that's typically just how we think about bodies of work. And when you start thinking about this context of moving into product mode, where you have a product and that product needs to continuously iterate. It needs to continuously get better. If every time I launch my banking app on my phone, it's not doing something better for me, likely I'm going to maybe look for a new banking app or a new bank, someone that's making it easier for me to consume and that can reach me easier and get me features easier. So the concept of continuously iterating and continuously improving my product is a common, or is a fun foundational kind of concept there. And it's interesting if you loop that back to the Rube Goldberg machine, one of the other major metrics that we need to start measuring is getting back to MTTR. How quickly can I identify an issue of how quickly can I identify an issue? Once I have, how quickly can I identify where that issue is and how quickly to resolve it? Because not only am I now potentially creating an outage in my product, I'm stopping the delivery of it as well. Potentially even I need to reallocate my resources towards building new features, towards resolution. So the longer they're doing that, now I'm missing my deployment targets. So how can I even troubleshoot that Rube Goldberg machine? If something did break, how long is that going to take? So even thinking about how you start to design and getting back to not thinking about things in a silo, but the overall operating model, this concept of continuous improvement, continuous innovation, and really shifting out of this project mode of having a defined start and stop period.
Well, let me ask a seemingly naive question then with respect to continuous iteration. If there's no end, how do you know you're making progress?
There's an easy answer to that. It's not that easy in practice, but there's a relatively easy way to see how you're making progress. And it's that simple change that Jeff was describing of changing the core metric. So like shifting from did we complete a project on time and on budget, which is a very common metric, but it is actually not thinking about the work effort as a product, switching it to how is our user base satisfied or not satisfied? Which services do they consume or not consume? What is the iteration velocity before and after a change? Is our mean time to recover within our SRE budget, right? Those latter metrics are in essence the metrics of continuous improvement, of continuous iteration. And if you think about it, and you just, all it takes is that little shift to go and say, I'm not delivering a project, I'm delivering a product, and I'm the product manager. If I was the product manager, I wouldn't really care about, like, did I do this increment of work in time or on budget? If I did it and it was on time and on budget and every one of my customers hated it, immediately you'd go like, well, that wasn't good, right? But if you're measuring these other metrics that are basically the leading metrics of iteration, they will naturally change the way that you deliver software, that you build platforms and infrastructure on which they run.
Yeah, Chad, I think you're dead on in that concept of how you think about it. And what's interesting is the channel of trying to help our clients understand technology like Tanzu and how that can help them out, how that can help be an enabler to their journey, and then helping the client with their strategy and execution of that. It's a great question because it becomes a different focus of how we prove our value to a client and ultimately how we help them prove their value to their internal organization. And so there's a couple ways that we've started to think about this. And it really starts with smaller bodies of work where you can find a friction point as quickly as possible and solve for that to show value. And that a lot of that comes down to observation. What are we actually measuring? How can we actually measure? Chad brought up a lot of these great metrics. So let's just take cycle time or lead time, for example. How can we actually start to measure that we're reducing that? And then if we do, it's pretty easy to actually take that, understand how much they're paying for full-time employees and say, hey, we just reduced this amount of real monetary budget out of this process because we were able to get past this friction point. Or maybe it's even a time base, a wall clock, whatever the case may be. So having metrics that you can measure is step one. Most of the way we start engagements, regardless of where clients are in their journey, is with some sort of a value stream mapping. If they're at the beginning of their journey, value stream mapping is helping them understand what are the things to measure. How do you start to actually, well, at least the way we think about it, how do you start to correlate those things and bring some observability and towards some sort of a KPI to understand what am I trying to march towards and am I actually starting to make progress? And then implementing, whatever tools or signals you need to actually start to measure that stuff. So you start with a lot of that, or maybe they've already done value stream mappings and we can understand, okay, this is how they're thinking about measurement. This is how they're thinking about observation, what's important to them. Maybe it needs to refine, or maybe we can plug into that. And once you start to understand how we can measure to show progress, it's really about breaking it down to one pilot app, one pilot feature. Too many people try to boil the ocean. Well, I need to build a container strategy for my entire organization. I need to build infrastructure as code to deploy every app. No, let's find one pilot app and run it through the entire pipeline. Everything's got dependencies. Everything's going to affect everything else. And then the other way that we start to really align this is starting to schedule work in terms of sprints. So again, stopping our thinking about selling things as projects, a body of work as a project, and starting to really realign with, in 6 sprints, this is the friction point that we've identified. This is the what progress we expect to make. And then when we are completed with that, we can now have some metrics to identify what we've accomplished, show value, show that this is working, showing what, that next friction point that we believe needs to be solved. So it's one of the ways that we try to help clients understand that, because it is difficult.
As we keep moving on here, I'll say one short thing, Jeff. You said something that's key, and sometimes knowing what is not good is as good as knowing what's good. If you find yourself saying, I'm going to build a container platform for the entire enterprise, you're on the wrong path. Every single one of those efforts I've seen at any customer of any size with incredibly intelligent teams ends up not working. It's the beginnings of ruin because whether you sense it or not, are doing a field of dreams, build it and they will come. So incrementalism, small steps done repeatedly is the path of success.
Okay, that's super. So you've talked about observation. What about security?
Yeah, Tom, it's a great point, and to me, they're tied together. As I'm putting together the slide for this, I actually think the three pictures are perfectly describe kind of how I view what's changing around security. And again, observability is part of that. The picture in the upper right corner is showing that obviously it's a security camera that's using observability for security purposes. From their perspective, they're observing the right things. They probably have the camera in the right place. Camera's probably the right thing. But are you actually observing what you're expecting to observe? And how do you actually have some checks and balances to make sure that what you're observing is what you expect to be observing? And so, as we kind of then filter through in terms of how security starts to change, the picture on the left to me is a great way of illustrating that security does fundamentally change in a cloud native world. It no longer can be centralized, owned by one team. It has to start becoming decentralized. It becomes responsibility of everybody, and you have to start thinking about how to automate security through test automation, through observability. And I look at the left side, and what's interesting about it is it depends on how you're looking at it. It shows that from one person's perspective, walking by, they see a security door, and they might think it's perfectly secure, whereas someone else who's looking at it from the context of, well, how can I get around security, sees that effectively the door is its own ladder to getting around it. But what else is interesting is what are you securing? If on the other side of that door is a bunch of really, really large equipment that even if someone was able to get over the door, like no big deal, they can't get it back over the door, then maybe I don't care that someone can hop over it. But it starts to think about shifting how you start to think about security. And then in that middle picture is really just showing how fundamentally, if you're not changing how you think about attack surfaces, how you think about your security posture, and that it's going to need to change, you're leaving yourself exposed. If you look at the White House, you think of what's probably the most secure building in the US, it's got to be the White House. I mean, it's got missile systems, guided missile systems on premises to be able to shoot down any potential air threat. Well, when they built those systems, drones didn't exist. And now you have this little drone in the White House lawn that could have some sort of, nefarious device attached to it that are highly secure systems. Because of one little change, all of a sudden now there's a gap and a risk there. So, to me, this whole concept of DevSecOps, if nothing else, it should tell you that security is fundamentally changing. I don't think it should be thought of separately necessarily as DevSecOps. It needs to be fundamentally part of how you're shifting. But again, it's you don't know what you don't know. People thinking about it differently. I think working with partners like Insight, leveraging some of the tools from VMware like Tanzu are really the only way you can start to wrap your hands around really how to secure cloud native infrastructure and applications.
I think you said something that is a transition there that I think is important. It needs to move from being like a process, an event where you plan for it, to something that focuses on adaptability. Jeff, I know you've got a funny story about trying to get stuff in and out of your house that is a good metaphor for adaptability.
Yeah, it's funny, as we were talking through this situation came up, and I thought it was just so apropos to where, I bought a house a few years ago, and if you look down, actually the middle picture is of my kitchen, and that the door that you can see at the far end on the left side there, crossing the refrigerator, is the closet there with the washer and dryer. And so at first glance, you're looking at it thinking, man, this is a really novel design. I mean, the washer dryer fits perfectly, so there's no wasted space. It's kind of out of the corner, in the corner, it's out of the way. It's got a door, so it doesn't look bad. It looks pretty, keeps the noise all in. And so fundamentally at first, when I first moved in, was like, wow, what a great design. Well, what then happened just 2 weeks ago is I had to do some maintenance because my dryer wasn't working. Well, imagine trying to pull that thing out of that little area and then negotiating that turn there and being able to actually do some work on this thing. Believe it or not, taking a dryer apart is really easy. It took me about 15 minutes to have that dryer and like 25 screws to have that dryer completely apart. It took me 45 minutes just to get it out, 45 minutes to twist it again, probably another hour to get it back. So the 4 hours it took me, most of that was just because the design was not built towards maintenance. It wasn't built towards the future. And then if I took that one step further, so I actually did fix the dryer, got it all pushed back. Well, then the washer, like a month later, is having problems. I called a guy because I was not willing to go through this pain again. And what's funny is I know this guy, and he refused to come over because he's like, Jeff, I know that you're just being lazy, and I'm not going to charge you like $150 an hour just for you being lazy. I'm like, I don't want to go through that pain again. And this is real. This is why shadow IT kind of got started, right? And the irony is right through that window, no kidding, right through that window there is a laundromat. I share a parking lot with a laundromat. But either way is then if I needed to actually do some real maintenance on this washing machine, even if I was able to get it all the way out of there, all the way down the stairs to where my garage is, and I have a pretty well laid out garage. I do a lot of my own work. My tools are everywhere. It's efficiently built. It's optimized. I looked at it and totally optimized. They built it. Well, how exactly am I supposed to get out the front door down that 29-inch wide pathway of a 27-inch wide dryer to get into my garage in the first place? So a lot of this just started to show that, you have to start thinking about it. The design looks perfect, but it's not adaptable. The guy, whoever designed it had to assume at some point I'm going to need to buy a new or replace or fix those appliances. It was never designed to be able to do that. Moving it from one optimized area to the other is nearly impossible. Getting back to that, yeah, I can optimizely work on it here. I can optimizely do my laundry. If I need to do maintenance, look at how long that's now going to take end to end.
The metaphor, just to bring this home for everybody, right, is that whether it's security or whether it's your budgeting processes, whether it's your technology stack, whether it's your infrastructure, or whether it's your washer and dryer, focusing on the adaptability, how easily can you respond to a change, is more important than trying to design for perfect, because there is no perfect. And if you're designing for fast iteration, including back to the security topic, you're thinking about not how am I going to build ironclad security policies that create gates that everyone will have to go through and they will be rigid. That, again, is an anti-pattern. That means you're going down a path of despair. Now, after all of the talk of despair, are there pictures where it's two kids running off a dock, jumping into a beautiful lake that's warm? In pre-COVID times? The answer is yes. There's lots and lots of customers from inside VMware, that are leaning on us. It's not just for technology, that are taking these people, process, and technology components that Jeff and I have been talking about, and have been making a ton of progress. And just to close this out, with calls to action, Jeff, I thought your reach across the table thing was a great one. Say a little more about what you've got in mind for that.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Because these are all super challenging issues that all companies are dealing with too. The biggest of the big, the Fortune ones. I mean, we're literally working with some of these, and they're struggling with this all the way to the mom and pa. And Insight has been able to help clients through all of these. We have established service capabilities and ways to help clients work through this. But we alone can't solve any client's problem. No tool will solve any client's problem. No partner can come in and solve any client's problem. We have ways that can help. We have experience of how organizations need to start changing, but ultimately, an organization needs to start changing from the inside out. And one of the areas where we see the biggest rub here is between infrastructure and the developers. And to me, infrastructure as code is going to be that bridge. You're going to get to a point where you cannot move fast enough or far enough or scale to a point you need to until you start getting your infrastructure teams and your app dev teams starting to work together. And a lot of it is just building those bridges. Where we see a lot of success is a concept called pair programming, where the infrastructure guy wants to write infrastructure as code, and he goes to the programmer and says, man, I would love for you to help me understand how to write code that is maintainable, is tenable. How do I comment my code? How do I start thinking about breaking it up into functions that are reusable? How do I start thinking about how to secure in a repo? So, just reach across the aisle, ask a developer. They're more than willing to help you. I think there's unnecessary friction here. So, ask them up for coffee, ask them just to have a conversation. You want to learn from them, they'll want to learn from you, and hopefully you can start to build some kumbaya.
And even if it's a virtual coffee, it's still effective. There's also a ton of resources that are free or near free. Great books. We've listed a couple. So the Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project, Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren and Jess Humble is awesome. We talked a lot about this project to product. There's a great book called Project to Product, something like that by Mick Kirsten. I'd highly recommend. Also, during COVID, conferences have become virtual and free. We've launched this huge thing, probably the best thing that we've done on this cloud native journey, not only the Cloud Native Computing Foundation work, around Kubernetes, but VMware and many others have piled into this thing called the Kube Academy. All the resources on there, you can get incredible access. There's hands-on labs that are provided. The thing that I would do ultimately, though, is really come to us with an idea. Not I want to know about what products you have, and ignore anyone from any company that comes and says, I've got a product that will solve world hunger. Just ignore us if we do that. But if you come to us and you say, I've got an application that I want to modernize, I want to tackle an incremental change to these components of the people, process, and technology parts of this modernization change, contact us. More than happy to help you.
Yeah, Chad, if I could just really tag on to that last point, because as we talked about with this transformation that clients are starting to make, a lot of the questions we get are, how do I start to set up my team for success? And do I go hire all these new skill sets? And I think the answer is it's both. You are going to need to hire some skill sets, but taking your existing teams and lifting them up and finding those ones that have that passion, that want to make this change, that want to do good things for the company, that are bringing the ideas. I suspect they're going to be, given a little bit more freedom and fostering and actually helping to drive some of the culture change that you want. So, be a part of that change, and companies like VMware and Insight are here to help.
Great stories, great insights, great advice. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's webcast. I want to give a big thanks to our speakers, Jeff Bozic of Insight and Chad Sakac of VMware, for sharing their expertise and insights with us today. Thanks especially to you, our viewers, for tuning in. Please be sure to check out the resources section on your console for links to some valuable Insight resources. Also, if you have a question or comment about today's webcast, just type it into the Q&A box on your console and hit the submit button. We'll get back to you with an answer within a few days. For Insight, VMware, and IDG, I'm Tom Schmidt.